So I became a pharmacist because I wanted to help people. And for a long time, I was trained by the system day after day, seeing patients taken care of through traditional medicine practices. But as I've got farther out of pharmacy school, I realized sometimes drugs aren't always the answer, and there's other places to look. And today, my guest has kind of had a similar journey through her sons as a pharmacist. And it's always cool to connect with the pharmacist on these because I think we've both seen not only how traditional medicine can help people, but more importantly, how taking a functional root cause approach can make a difference in terms of helping change patients' lives, especially learning how root cause along with medications can have an impact. And I'm joined today by Dr. Lauren Castle and super excited to have her conversation, how her journey to functional medicine has had an impact on her, but also our patients. Lauren, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
Awesome. If you don't know much about Dr. Lauren Castle is a PharmD, functional medicine practitioner and founder and CEO of the Functional Medicine Pharmacists Alliance, the first professional organization representing pharmacists in functional medicine. And it's got nearly 5,000 members now. She holds a Master of Science in Human Nutrition and Functional Medicine. She's certified in functional medicine and sits on the board of directors of the Psychedelic Pharmacists Association. Lauren's path from conventional pharmacy to functional medicine, psychedelic, and understanding functional medicine wasn't just professional, it was actually deeply personal. And that's what we're going to start out with today. So I know you and I talked a little earlier. Your husband was feeling horrible, fatigued, not himself, and you were a traditional pharmacy manager back there giving the traditional textbook ideas, eat better, sleep better, exercise, and it wasn't working. Tell me how did that make you feel and kind of where that changed to where you're at today in terms of your technique, in terms of taking care of not only your family, but patients?
Yes. So our story started back in 2016. I was a new pharmacy manager. We were living in Michigan at the time. My husband was in sort of middle management for corporate America as well. So we were, quote unquote, living the dream. But he was just really struggling with his health. We were doing everything right, or at least what I thought was right, of, like you said, eating less, exercising more, trying to get good sleep. I mean, we both were in pretty stressful jobs, but trying to manage the stress as best we could. And it just seemed like nothing we did would really help his symptoms. And he had everything across the board, from like sinus problems to gut issues, just general like anxiety and like difficulty sleeping at night. And just like really feeling like crap all the time. And so, when I looked at it, I was like, well, I can make OTC recommendations for like increasing your fiber or, taking some Claritin D, like when your sinus and allergies and stuff act up. But like, if you go to the doctor, they're probably just going to put you on like an SSRI or a weight loss drug. I mean, again, this was like 2016 in Metro Detroit, like everyone was on phentermine. And I was like, I don't think that's what you need. Like maybe it would shed a couple pounds. Maybe it would give you a little more energy, but like, there's got to be something else going on. Like we're young. We are in our 20s. We should not be feeling like this. So we actually got a flyer in the mail from an integrative wellness center. And I sort of looked at it and it was like all of these symptoms. And I was like, you have all of these. Like, I don't know what functional medicine is, but I'm going to research it. And maybe you should go check out this, it was actually a chiropractor, which I thought was a little strange too. But I was like, they're doing this like free seminar thing. Like maybe you can just go find out. Like, I really think we need to look into this. So as I started researching, this was right around the time that the Cleveland Clinic was starting their Center for Functional Medicine. So we both went to Ohio Northern University. And whenever I saw that, I was like, well, if Cleveland Clinic is like literally building a whole center around this, I think there's something to it. And so I kept digging. He ended up going to the seminar and signing up for this program. And of course, everything was out of pocket and it was a couple $1,000s, which seemed crazy at the time to pay that much money for something when it's like we're used to using our insurance, right? And I'm sure these are all things that a lot of people feel when they're first looking into functional medicine or, health and wellness services. But it just felt like the right person to be able to really help. Like he really listened to my husband and like got to know him. And he's like, yeah, we can totally help you. Like we do this all the time. So he went through, this intake, this process, tons and tons of lab work. And some of these tests that I wasn't familiar with, things like a food sensitivity test, and looking at different hormone levels and some of these things. And all the results came back, and it turned out he had sensitivities to gluten and dairy, which so many people do, and they just don't know it. But he also had candida overgrowth in his gut. And that was like the eye-opening moment for me, because I was like, well, the only thing I learned about candida in pharmacy school was for immunocompromised patients that have things like HIV and, are immunosuppressed. And sometimes you can get these fungal infections that can be life-threatening. That is it. Like, the idea of understanding candida as a yeast overgrowth that could happen in a normal person's gut was completely foreign to me. And so, again, I started digging deeper into this and realizing that, like, no, there are actually treatments we can do. You can use antifungal therapies for it, but oftentimes you can actually use herbal medicines for it. Things like oregano, berberine, some of these other compounds that, when you're looking at it through the functional medicine lens, we're not just talking about, taking a little sprinkle of oregano from your cabinet and like putting it in your food. Sure, that, is going to have some phytonutrient benefits, but we're talking about like clinical strength, sort of blending these worlds of herbalism and modern day science to get these very potent products that can actually have a really significant impact on your microbiome. So we went through an entire elimination diet, which, again, that was sort of new to me. I had heard of things like Whole30, but had not actually gone down the path of doing it. And so I, of course, decided to just follow the protocol with him for the elimination diet, since that was easier for us as far as cooking goes. And by the end of that first month, I felt like a new person too. And I was like, I didn't even think I had any problems or that I felt bad. Like, I thought I was doing great. And now I have like tons more energy. I'm sleeping so much better. Like, my digestion is better. Like, this is amazing. So at that point, I was completely sold, and I started looking into, how do I do this as a pharmacist? And not just how do I do this with my own patients in community pharmacy, but how do I start telling other pharmacists about this? Because it was so new, and like, the different types of trainings and certifications that I was seeing online, I was like, I don't know that this is going to translate very well. And a lot of them required you to like go out to a conference for 5 days. And I was like, I barely have 2 weeks of vacation as a new pharmacist. So like, this isn't going to work. But luckily I found an online program through the University of Western States that was a master's degree in nutrition and functional medicine. And that was in partnership with IFM. So it was the perfect program. I had already been looking into doing like a master's either in business or public health, something just to sort of like set me apart on my, leadership path within retail pharmacy. But this was really perfect. So it was all meant to be. And I finished that program, and we moved around a few more times. And yeah, like, the rest is kind of history. I started speaking at some pharmacy conferences about functional medicine, and that was what sort of birthed, our organization for FMPHA. Was like, okay, now we need to like stay in touch with all these pharmacists that are actually getting into this space, but there's no place for us. So I made a Facebook group, and it's grown from there.
So someone listening might be like, you're pharmacist, like you give drugs to sick people, but now you're trying to say, wait a minute, I know better than that, and I can do different things. How would you explain that to somebody who may have that concept? Like, that's all a pharmacist knows. Can you explain like maybe why a pharmacist has an ability to go beyond that? Because it's learning about sick people and how drugs work actually help us to reverse engineer that to do functional medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. The really interesting thing whenever I was applying for my master's degree program is I had to have a letter of recommendation. And I actually went back and asked my biochemistry professor from pharmacy school, who I had done a nutrition teaching rotation with. Like, I had no clue where my life was headed and like what functional medicine was back when I was a student. And yet my training had the exact, like, perfect preparation for this path that I was going on. So, as pharmacists, we really do learn the biochemistry side of medicine, and not just drugs like pharmaceutical medicines, but it's very applicable across a lot of different areas, right? From nutrition and how nutrients work in the body to herbals and how plants can work in the body. It's all that intersection between chemistry and biochemistry and physiology. So that is just how our brains are trained to think, which is very in line with the way that functional medicine is practiced out on, a more macro scale. So the way I like to explain it is that, in healthcare, you want to have a team surrounding you as a patient. You don't want to have just one person that has to be responsible for everything. We see this all the time, right? That like so many patients try to go into their primary care doctor's office for an appointment and there's long waits or they only get 15 minutes with them. It's like crazy to think that we're just going to have one doctor try to be responsible for everything. And then that's why medicine has become so specialized that we have different, specialists and things like that, because it's too much for one person to try and manage. So I like to think of the PCP and the pharmacist as sort of like the quarterback team, right? Like we see all of the medications that a patient is taking, and we're able to really have that communication line open with all of the physicians on the team. And that can alleviate some of the burden of the primary care physician, because their job really is to look at, the bigger picture as well, and focusing more on the diagnostic part of things, where we can focus more on the therapeutic side of things and really optimizing the medications. And that happens a lot too, where, one doctor prescribes a medicine, but you go to ask a question about it and then they say like, oh, well, we can't answer that. Like you need to go back to that doctor and answer it. Whereas a pharmacist, we can say, hey, yeah, let us follow up with your physicians. We can talk to all of them. And that's a very common example that we just find, even in 2026, we don't have a true centralized medical record, right? So it's like there are times that things get missed. And so just having that pharmacist on your team to really be able to help you manage all of the medication, supplements, anything like that just makes so much sense.
So I want to ask about something you mentioned earlier. I know you do a lot of plant medicine and herbals and things like that. And you mentioned something I think is critical for people to understand that sometimes, even me as probably a pharmacist, when I got out of pharmacy school, I'd be like, oh, that's nobody, I don't believe that. But now that I've gotten out and I understand, you mentioned it. Talk to me about plant medicine. Like you mentioned, let's say you grab turmeric out of your cabinet and you cook with it versus turmeric you would take, or you mentioned like oregano oil, how there's like a standardization, almost like we have a standardization of like what a USP would look like for a drug, because this is what the science says it needs to be, this quality. Explain to me that difference between like herbal and plant medications versus traditional meds. And how would you explain that as a pharmacist that does what you do?
Yeah, I love this question. And there's no right or wrong on this. I've been having a lot of really deep conversations with a fellow pharmacist friend of mine. Her name's Marina Booksoff. I'm going to give her a shout out because she is a clinical herbalist and a pharmacist. And so the path of herbalism is really where pharmacy sort of originated. Before we had drugs, all we had was plants. And we learned, millennia ago, how to use plants in a medicinal way. We think about things like pharmacognosy is sort of the origins of that. And that is what bloomed into drug development. Things like aspirin coming from willow bark, things like statin drugs coming from, the fungus that we found in red yeast rice. Like there's all of these plant origins of the drugs that we use today. But mechanistically, there are different ways that they work. And I think there's a time and a place for different types of therapies. So in an ideal world, we would be able to have, all of our food grown in nutrient-rich soil. We would have access to all of the local plants and herbs that we need when we need them. But unfortunately, a lot of us live in cities today, and we don't have access to fresh, healthy food grown right outside of our doorstep, or herbs that we can pick right from our garden to make, a medicinal tincture with. Although I just made a medicinal tincture for the first time last week. And it was like a beautiful process to actually do myself as a pharmacist. And so we have different disease states now that have really started to affect our health in different ways. And sometimes we need a stronger approach whenever the disease state has gotten more serious, right? So in the case of my husband's, gut dysbiosis, just using regular oregano probably isn't going to make a huge difference, at least not fast enough. Maybe over time, just doing the elimination diet and starting to eat more of the different foods and things. But I think that's the beauty of functional medicine, is that it's sort of blending these worlds of this traditional sort of herbal approach with the modern science that we have to take and sort of standardize the different extracts and the nutrients or the phytochemicals into something that's a little bit more powerful, more targeted, and ultimately can provide more relief quicker for patients that are really struggling, right? And that, I think, sums it up for me. It's like, we don't have to suffer. I believe that the science has evolved alongside of the plant world and, the chemical world, that we don't have to suffer. We have these tools and they're meant to be used. And I think at the heart of medicine, that's what we're all here to do. That's why we became pharmacists. That's why we become doctors, is because we want to help people heal. We don't want to see people suffering. We want people to live to their fullest potential. And sometimes we get off track, right? But at the end of the day, our bodies are really smart. And I think that's the one place that sometimes in medicine, we've kind of forgotten, and we've gotten away from that understanding that a symptom is not something that we should just suppress. An elevated cholesterol number is not something that we should just treat in isolation and say, here, take this drug so we can get this down so you don't have a heart attack. It's a signal that our body is sending us that there is something wrong, that's out of balance, that we can do something about it. But if you just take a pill to treat a number or to treat a symptom without understanding what's causing it, that's how we end up with things like polypharmacy, where you're just treating and adding more medications and never truly getting better or feeling better. And oftentimes you're creating new problems because we're not digging deep enough to fix what's actually out of balance.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people forget that we as pharmacists, if you go back the days, it was mortars and pestles and bottles full of medicinal powders that we had them mixed in. It wasn't pulled a commercially available drug off the shelf that's been chemically synthesized. And you're right. And many of the drugs, like I even think of like the GLP-1 explosion, most people don't realize that was originally found in the saliva of a lizard in nature that then Big Pharma took and changed it chemical. It's just so crazy how you look at that as far as looking at those things and how that affects our body. When you look at your own health journey and kind of looking at things we learn, like we're taught a certain set of principles and values in pharmacy school. But then a lot of times what I've learned myself and many people I've interviewed is that something happens in their life. I know publicly you've mentioned about kind of hitting a wall with depression, had some grief that you had with losing your mom, PTSD. You went through a lot of different therapies and treatment with that, spent a lot of time, but something shifted in that. And take me through kind of what happened where from your pharmacist brain of what was working then to kind of what changed to kind of set you on the path that you're at today.
Yes, absolutely. So my husband is sort of who brought us into functional medicine. But if you fast forward a couple of years from there, in 2019, I was sort of living like my dream. I was actually working on a functional medicine project at my employer, the largest company in the world, and hoping that we were finally going to bring functional medicine into the mainstream, which of course, 2020 happened, COVID happened, all of that sort of just disappeared out of thin air. And I realized that I couldn't wait for an employer to make my dreams come true. I really needed to take that step out for myself. But it was sort of the perfect storm of, a lot of stress happening at work. We had no idea what was going on. We were, working around the clock trying to figure out how to manage this pandemic situation that we were in. But at the same time, I was caregiving for my mom who had liver cirrhosis and had struggled with alcoholism her whole life. And it was so difficult, right? I was trying to balance my corporate job with this new organization I had started and being a caregiver. And I just finished my master's degree the year before. I was like very, on this like health and fitness path for myself and not competing in bodybuilding competitions, but training like I was. And, a lot of people forget sometimes that athletic training at that level is actually a major stressor on your body. Yes, you might look healthy on the outside and be super fit and strong, but it creates a lot of stress inside of your body. And so that was something that I just wasn't aware of until the signs kind of started to show up. I had finally gotten to the point in my own functional medicine journey that I realized it was time for me to stop taking birth control. So I had been on the NuvaRing, which for women who are listening to this podcast, most of you are probably familiar with things like the pill, which is an oral hormonal contraceptive. Downsides of oral birth control is that there's something called the first pass effect, where your liver has to metabolize all of that estrogen and progesterone hormones, most of which are a synthetic form, in order to have your body metabolize them. There are metabolites that can happen that create more estrogenic or cancer-causing types of metabolites. So I thought in my own mind, right, I'm doing a little bit better because I'm bypassing that problem by using a different route of administration. And really and truly, so many of us as women go on birth control when we're 16, 17, 18, even younger today, because so many girls are starting their cycles even earlier. They're having pain and cramping and, heavy menstrual flows. And so they end up just getting prescribed birth control as the only tool that gynecologists are given to manage these symptoms, right? Again, symptoms, but really they're signals of imbalance in our body, and our bodies are asking us to live in a different way. But oftentimes we don't listen. We just think, oh, I can take this pill or I can take this, birth control and I can live my life. And that is what I did for 15 years. I lived my life on these hormones like I was Superwoman. And at the time, it felt great. I felt like, I don't have to worry about all of this. Like I felt bad for women who were just struggling month to month with, cycles and things. And I'm thinking, in my own mind, oh, well, I don't have any problems. Little did I know, I had so many problems happening under the surface that were completely masked by the fact that I was on these hormones. So when I finally decided to go off, just based on my own research and feeling like, it's time to really explore what it's like to live my life in my own body instead of, living my life in these cycles with these extra hormones in my system, I just thought, I'll stop taking it. I'll start doing family planning, which for those who wear an Aura ring, there is an FDA approved app called Natural Cycles that is actual birth control. Like we're talking over 90% effective. And it's really amazing. It uses temperature tracking in order to map out your cycle for you. So I started doing all of this and thinking like, okay, it's just going to come back. 1 month goes by, 2 months goes by, 3 months goes by, still nothing. So I just go to my gynecologist and ask her like, hey, should we do any lab tests to see what's going on? She's like, no, it'll come back. Sometimes it just takes a few months when you first go off birth control. So then we get to 6 months, still nothing. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm starting to get a little worried. I'm going to run a Dutch test for myself. My OBGYN was like, I don't know what that test is. It's not clinically validated. I didn't learn about it, so I'm not going to read it for you. So that's okay. I know how to read it myself, so I'll just do it myself. That test came back and all of my hormone levels were essentially like borderline menopausal, like flat, just nothing. And I'm in my early 30s. So I was like, okay, well, now what do I do? Right. They were trying to work me up for things like PCOS, which I clearly did not fit the picture of that whatsoever. Like my testosterone levels and things were fine. My insulin levels were fine. Um, I didn't have polycystic ovaries. And then they were like, well, we can just give you, medroxyprogesterone so we can stimulate a cycle. And, that way it'll come back. And I was like, but it's not. It's not coming back. That's literally just giving me a pill. And everything that I had read was like, if you don't actually have the hormone levels naturally, you're not going to have a lining to shed. You're not going to be able to just force a period when your body is not actually even operating in that way. So I said, no, I think I'm going to do a little more digging and research and figure out what's really going on here. And that ultimately led me to understanding something called hypothalamic amenorrhea, and also post-birth control syndrome. So I was essentially in this sort of state of being so stressed that my body had shut down the ability for me to have cycles, because there was no way I was going to be safe enough to even think about getting pregnant, right? My body knew what it was doing. So all it needed was to come back into safety, right? Like the key was in actually supporting my own organ systems. So yes, doing a version of an elimination diet, but eating like 2,500 calories a day to really bring back the nutrient levels that we needed to produce the hormones, right? So often we underfuel, we undereat as women because we're trying to look a certain way or stay fit or slim or lose weight. And so we restrict calories thinking that that is going to help us be healthy. But really and truly, we need fuel. We need nutrients to produce the hormones. And whenever we're not giving our body enough good, healthy food, we're actually going to worsen those problems. So worked on rebalancing my nutrition, actually cutting out exercise and focusing on stress reduction and like truly just like very gentle yoga, very gentle nature walks outside. And the thing that finally, kind of changed everything is that my mom passed away. And that was devastating for me. I had never lost anyone that was, close to me in that way. And I had been, again, caregiving for her for 4 years. But I had started doing acupuncture around that time as well. I had, read some things about that being helpful for hormone balancing. And within a month after my mom had passed, my cycles came back. So it was just really, really clear at that point that, again, our bodies are so smart and we don't give them enough credit. We just blame them and think that they're broken and something's wrong with us, when really and truly they are doing everything they can to help us survive. And that was just such a huge realization for me. You mentioned that the healing journey didn't end there. That was just the physical part of the healing. But the emotional toll and the toll that it had taken on my mental health with, the anxiety and struggling to function at work, I didn't really feel equipped to deal with that. And thankfully, our employer did have, like a hotline you could call, talk to a therapist. And my boss was actually the one who sort of identified that for me and said, hey, I know you've been going through a lot. I think you should take some time and like process this and use these resources that we have and see what they say. So I made the phone call and they were like, yeah, based on all the things you're describing, you need to take a leave of absence from work. And I couldn't believe it. I was like shocked, because I just thought I could keep pushing through and keep going. But everyone around me kind of saw it and they were like, no, you need to take the time to grieve properly and not just bury yourself in the work. And so I took 10 weeks of leave, which again it's a benefit from an employer, right? So often like we don't take all of our vacation, or we don't use our FMLA, or, we just think that we're going to get through it. But it was the best thing that I could have ever done for myself. And I, mentioned that I had been helping my mom all this time. I had never been to therapy in 30 plus years of having a mom who struggled with addiction. And that was such a realization too, that I was like, wow, I think depending on generation you grew up in, like I'm a millennial, that was kind of just starting to come out, right? Like maybe some kids that had ADHD or some things like that had seen therapists, but for a lot of us, like that just, it wasn't something that we talked about. We didn't really share about our mental health or things like that. So it was just really amazing to be in sort of like a group setting with other humans that were just figuring out how to do life together, and recognizing that, yeah, life can be really hard sometimes and pretty traumatic, even though we know it's coming, right? Like we all know that life isn't finite, it's not going to last forever. But going through therapy really just gave me a whole new set of tools that to me were central to functional medicine, right? So with functional medicine, we look at the physical health, all the different clinical imbalances, but at the very center of it is the mind, body, and spirit, or the mental, emotional, and spiritual. And that was where the pieces started to come together a little bit more of sort of what was missing, right? Like you can be healthy physically, but you can also still be struggling from a mental health standpoint, or dealing with, emotional issues or trauma, or even spiritual disconnection. And just really, whether you grew up in a spiritual home or religion or you didn't, just connecting with something bigger than yourself and just recognizing how magical and what a gift it is to even be alive, to have our health, to have the opportunity to be here. We lose sight of that. And I think that can also drive a lot of the physical symptoms that our body gives us too. I can't tell you how many patients and clients that I've worked with over the years that come in with all of these, physical symptoms and mental health symptoms. But we really get into it and we find that their job is driving almost all of it. And it's so hard to make those changes, right? It's so much easier to just take a pill.
Right. No, that's such a powerful story. And I appreciate you sharing that. You really took a deep dive in what your journey has been. But sadly, it's not your journey. We hear that so often with our patients. And you're right, there's that spiritual side. And I would almost agree, working with patients like you, we can throw supplements at them. We can throw a good diet at them. We can improve their sleep and work on an exercise plan. But if that spiritual wellness is not there, it is so hard to get somebody to where they want to be on a wellness journey. Do you feel the same way about that?
Yeah, for sure. And up until now, I don't think that the spiritual conversation has been a big piece of healthcare, right? I mean, certainly we have mental health medications, which are very much in the news right now, just given some of the things that are going on with, psychedelics being in the news. But psychedelics are sort of an interesting class of medications, if you want to think of them that way, with the executive order that's come out, kind of fast tracking the research, clinical research on, again, these isolated molecules. We're not talking about, taking the plant or mushroom directly from the earth and putting that into a pharmacy. We're talking about those isolated compounds and finding ways to study, the mechanisms of how they work And I think there's pros and cons to that. But at the end of the day, these molecules, these compounds are working on sort of a different level. It's more than just the old serotonin theory of depression, which we've actually had some meta-analysis that have come out recently that have shown how that theory isn't the whole picture. It's not actually accurate. You could go in and kind of read it, but essentially it's showing that just boosting levels of serotonin in the brain isn't the mechanism that underlies depression or anxiety. It's actually this sort of multifaceted biopsychosocial condition. And as we're starting to understand more about, well, how do we help people with that? How do we, treat these conditions? That's sort of where, like we mentioned, these plant medicines or these chemical psychedelic medicines could potentially play a role, is because they're really working at a different level, a different mechanism that most people would describe as being very spiritual. It's almost kind of funny to read the research papers sometimes because, in clinical studies, we use these different types of rating scales to try to objectively measure the experience that someone is having, the symptoms that they're having. Well, in psychedelic research, they literally have like a mystical rating scale, to say like how much, sense of oneness did you feel, or sense of awe or wonder, or, all of these things that we've never really tried to measure before, but that are so important to someone's well-being. So I think it's a really interesting time. And, for us as pharmacists, we may or may not have gotten much exposure to these types of therapies in pharmacy school. I know for me, I think we had one lecture in our psychiatry module that sort of just lumped in all quote unquote illicit drugs in one, right? So we're learning about things like cocaine while we're also learning about things like psilocybin. And they're very different. But again, something that I also really learned, through working with someone with addiction is that, again, all of these chemicals, all of these substances, whether it's alcohol or heroin or cocaine, they might be very addictive substances, but they are clearly meeting a need and they are relieving someone's pain. And that is why they are using them, because it's actually keeping them alive at the same time that it is potentially destroying their health. It is also keeping them alive by giving them an outlet to manage the pain and suffering that they're dealing with. And of course, the hope is that we can help people find healthier ways to manage that pain and to manage that suffering. And I think that is what these psychedelic medicines are being explored for, right? Things like ibogaine being looked at for addiction. Psilocybin has been studied for addiction. There's just so many more, and there's so much more research to understand. And the really interesting thing is that these substances, these plants, again, have been around for millennia in other tribes and cultures. And we've, in America particularly, we just never had true access to any of those things. Of course, Native Americans that were here long before we were had peyote. So all of these different cultures around the world have had access to these psychedelic plants and really looked at them as sort of a rite of passage, where these were seen as very important plants that you didn't just go take them willy-nilly for fun. They were something that the elders of the tribes had knowledge of and experience with and would teach, generations how to work with these in a safe way and in a spiritual way so that they could have that healing potential instead of the harms that we've seen, in American culture with the war on drugs and the 70s and all of those things, right? So I think it's interesting.
You You brought up something really interesting there because you're right. When we were taught these at pharmacy schools, we're taught, but then they're like, we don't touch those. Like those are non-negotiables. But now we're learning, and just at a high level for people that don't understand, you mentioned something. These are therapies, but to be used with other things. Because I think the most powerful things, whether it be psilocybin, ketamine, MDMA, it isn't just the drug. It's the drug and the treatment that goes with it is where the power comes in, because we're able to access parts of the brain and do things. Is that how you see these fitting in as part of a total, once again, root cause treatment of the brain, not just throw a drug at it? Is that how you see that?
100%. You know, I think the most interesting and important part to realize with the psychedelic medicines is, like we said, they're very, very powerful. They're very potent. And just thinking that it's going to be a magic pill that you can take one time and it's going to cure your depression or cure your PTSD is not how these work. They absolutely are used in conjunction with therapy, right? Because what they do is to actually sort of bring everything up to the surface for you to be able to evaluate. And if you're not properly prepared for that, it can actually be traumatizing in and of itself because you're in what we call an altered state of consciousness. So not like me and you sitting here having a conversation, right? It is truly just almost inexcribable or indescribable. And so there's so much that goes into it in terms of working with qualified practitioners, working with therapists, making sure you have the tools from, that mental and emotional standpoint to really be able to do this work. But then on the other side of it as well, not just having a safe experience. Typically these types of medicines are given in a therapist's office, under the supervision. And it's a few hours long, it can be a couple hours to 6 or 7 or 8 hours even. And then after that, sort of unpacking everything that came out of that session to really understand, what does it all mean? And how do you actually use that experience to make the changes in your life to help you live a better life and to help you, work through relationships or to heal old wounds or find forgiveness or whatever it may be. There's so much more that goes into it. So it's not something that, we can take lightly. It's not something that works like just a magic pill. It's really just the beginning of a lifelong journey of hopefully understanding and healing from whatever pain or trauma has come up.
Lauren, I think you brought a real world aspect of how really pharmacists are now at this intersection of a lot of these new therapies, because it's more than just a drug. We didn't even get into like all the drug interactions with these that can happen. They're powerful. They affect so many things. But I think you really kind of nutshelled how these are so powerful, not only in your own personal journey of what you've seen, but also working with patients. And thank you so much, because I think you're right. These are a true outlet for a lot of patients that honestly, to this point, they had to rely on other drugs, i.e. alcohol, illicit drugs, and things like that, where there's real hope for these patients now. And I really appreciate you sharing that. That's awesome.
Absolutely.
Just looking forward, just in your thing, functional pharmacy, what's the future look like for that?
Well, I'm really excited for it because, I've been in this space for 10 years now. And when we first started, we tried to sort of introduce functional medicine into the pharmacy ecosystem and, talking about it to pharmacy organizations. And there just really wasn't any interest. It was like, there's not enough evidence for this. We're going to stick to the randomized controlled trials and things like that. So we sort of went over into the functional medicine space and said, well, over here, you guys really need to think about including pharmacists as part of the care team. It's a huge gap and, an opportunity for us to be able to help patients use their medications more safely, the supplements more safely, to look for nutrient interactions. So we made a lot of headway in bringing more pharmacists into functional medicine. And now it's kind of coming back full circle where the pharmacy organizations are starting to see that, oh, wait, yeah, this is the future. This is where we need to be headed. And so we've had some great partnerships and presentations, on functional medicine at different national pharmacy organizations like ASCP or APHA. But now I'm even more excited because I feel like the worlds are really coming together. I'll be attending the Institute for Functional Medicine conference at the end of May, on May 30th, and actually doing a presentation with two of my fellow pharmacists on the role of pharmacists in functional medicine. The other cool thing that has recently happened is that Parsley Health, which is one of the largest functional medicine clinics in the nation, recently got approved for in-network coverage under insurance. So this has been the dream all along, is that functional medicine doesn't have to be this separate, expensive, cash pay, type of service that's only available for people with resources. Now we finally do have enough economic data to show that this works better than the standard of care of conventional medicine, and it deserves to be covered under insurance. So the worlds are finally starting to come together. And again, political affiliations aside, I think that there's a lot of work happening at the federal level, looking at how we can incorporate better nutrition, how we can look at deprescribing medications and really helping patients to, find this middle ground of what does it look like to use medicine where it's needed, but to use lifestyle where we can. So I'm really excited. It just feels like all of my worlds are finally colliding, and I love that. So I think the future is here now, which is just a really exciting time to be in. So
I tell all my pharmacist friends in the traditional world, because I still live there some, that's the one thing we may have to thank PBMs for, because PBMs have forced pharmacies to have to do things to, more importantly, we all got in this to help patients, but also pay the bills, which unfortunately putting pills in bottles doesn't do that anymore. And I feel like there's a lot more pharmacists that are opening up and embracing this, because I still want to help patients, but I have to do it in a way that I can make a living. And honestly, doing functional pharmacy is one of those things that allows you to do that. And hearing that the insurance is actually recognizing it is even really more cool. So that's awesome to hear that. For you, you're a wealth of information. You have so much great stuff out there. People want to learn more about you and what you do, Lauren. Where can they find you at?
So our website for pharmacists interested in functional medicine is fmpha.org. That's the Functional Medicine Pharmacists Alliance. We're also working on resetting up our directory so that if you're a patient and you're looking for a functional pharmacist, you'll be able to go there to get in touch. You can always just send us a message on our contact form, and we're happy to connect you directly with someone in your state. We have pharmacist leaders in every state across the country, which is really exciting because that's part of our mission, is to help make functional medicine more accessible and affordable so that it can be the standard of care, and have pharmacists really be a part of that. And the other website you can find me at is drlaurencastle.com.
Very cool. Thank you. I think from today's conversation, if you haven't realized, if you don't have a functional pharmacist as part of your care team, you're kind of missing the boat, because I think they have so much to bring. And Lauren, I know you bring so much. You have such great information out there. But I think today, if you haven't realized that before, be sure you share this podcast with others so they can learn that. And just really grateful for you being here, Lauren, to discuss really what the power of a functional pharmacist can do. I want to thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Steve.